Hi everyone. I'm using some new software here, so hopefully this works and hopefully it allows you to see what I'm doing with this table. What I've got up on the screen is the Word version of the table for recording your stories. Now, of course, this is the table and the handout that you'll be allowed to bring into the SAC planning session, so you can choose whether you write by hand or whether you write on a device and then print it out, but you'll of course need hand copies. Said as you were leaving class the other day that you need to restrict your space per story just to 2 pages, so that's either 1 page double-sided or 2 A4 pages, so you can space out the document much more than I have in this version. This is a single A4 page, and you might find that that's enough with using your novel as well. So I just thought I'd go through what each of the fields essentially means, because I think sometimes they're a little bit unclear, and also just the sort of stuff that you might put in there. Okay, so obviously the field at the very top of the screen is for writing in the text title, so we'll do that. So in this case the boat, but you'll have to do that for each individually. The protagonist is obviously the person that drives the story forward. Now I think that this for the boat is somewhat complicated, because obviously the story is told from the point of view of the son, and he's perhaps the narrator, but the protagonist, as the person that drives the story forward, you could make an argument that it is actually the father, but I think it is still actually the son, because it centers on him and it follows the trajectory of his life. So I'd write there the son in his adolescence, let's say in his childhood, and then you could say perhaps the father, as his choices also drive the story. Now you can't really have, seeing my terrible typing skills here, you can't have 2 protagonists, you can only have 1. So really this is a choice, but you're just making that indication. So a brief note there. Narrative point of view is the son, but I think it's worth making the distinction here that it's reflective as an adult looking back on formative moments. Okay, so looking back on those moments that shaped him and made him the person that he is today. Okay. For the theme aspects, which are these next few here, so all of these ones, I'm going to just color code them in yellow so you can see the ones that I'm talking about. For these ones, I think it's worth thinking about whether in fact they all apply. Now in this instance, I think that they do. And then what you're really looking for, and hopefully you can draw on some of your flagging and tagging for this, is to look for where those themes are evident. So the theme of tradition is perhaps evident. I won't write evident because that'll be in all of them. So I would just write here in the mother, not bother, in the mother. And then what you want to do is find a page reference or a quote to indicate that the mother reflects that theme. So for instance here it might be the idea of her activity, it might be the way that she talks about, what would they know of our land and our seas. any of those sort of quotes that show that she's holding on to that older way or that traditional way of life would work well there. Of course, you can have something else, but that's the sort of thing. This idea of limiting or liberating, I think, is present in the father's choice. Okay, and perhaps you can look at again a page reference or a quote, but in this case, I think it might be looking at perhaps the outcome for the son. In the ending. Okay, so you might look at that ending, you might again have some page reference or quote that gives that indication. In terms of page referencing and quotes, the way that I would do it is I'd say, say page 18, and then you might write in brackets the paragraph number, so paragraph 4 to 5 if you're having a long quote. So that way, when you're reflecting on this in the SAC or in revision, you can find it very, very easily. Okay, so I hope you get the idea of these themes. I'll just help you with these ones because I know you're working on your own. So outsiders and belonging, I think, is the tourists, and perhaps particularly the mother's views of the tourists, or the mother's views of the tourists, or the restaurant. Can't spell today. I'll write cafe. That the daughters work at, that sort of thing. Okay. Continuing on, the idea of we've got education and literature. Obviously, this is the father's room and his habits, and what they do for the son or the daughters. Now, you can write these out a little bit more fully, but you can see also the way that I'm taking notes to trigger me in. And of course, I'm not doing the page referencing. I think you can do that on your own, or the recording of quotes. But I am doing fairly brief notes just to keep this video fairly short for you. We're on to outsiders and belongings. So in that case, sorry, I've stuffed up the order there. So nice thing about doing this in Word, obviously, the father's room is for education and literature. I've got transition and change in the wrong place. So that one, the transition and change was outsiders and belonging here. Sorry, so my mistake. The transition and change, we have obviously the son's choice and the daughters moving away. So any comments or commentary in the text on those sorts of things, or people's views on those sorts of things, is worthwhile. The last one there is death, and we have, say, the reasons for the father's choice. Now, what you might start to see is that there's certain moments in the text that tie up a number of the themes. So what we can see here is we've got obviously the reading of literature ties into a number of things there. So we've got obviously the transition and change, we've got education and literature, we've got even the connection to outsiders and a sense of belonging are tied up in that literature that's kept in the father's room. And we've also got the mother and her behaviour tying into a few. We've also got the end of the text, the choice that's made, the decision and sort of the pushing the son away. So I guess one of the benefits of doing this table is that it allows you to really zero in on a couple of moments in each story that are really ripe and really hold a lot of promise for analysis, or whether it's text response, or perhaps target you towards a moment for the the gap in the text to be explored, to allow you to write about that moment from perhaps a different point of view, or flesh it out a little bit further, but be exploring some of those ideas and themes. Okay, so in terms of values and ideas, given that you've just looked at themes, I think it's worthwhile there thinking about the idea that comes through most strongly. What is MacLeod trying to, or because we don't know him, perhaps what is the text perhaps pushing us towards thinking about most clearly as we read this text? And this is really an interpretation, I guess, so there's no right or wrong answer. It's what you feel the text is about. For me, I feel it's about choice and duty, and perhaps it's about the tension between these, the idea that they're perhaps competing. Now, you can flesh that statement out if you wish. You can, of course, support it with some discussion or some reference to page numbers or moments, but I really see that cell of the table as being a reflection on those yellow rows above. That, you know, what's the thing that stands out most for you? If we've talked about the themes of the text, this is really going, okay, well, those are the themes, those are the ideas that are being explored, but perhaps what's the idea that's being pushed forward out of those? What's the opinion coming through in the text? What's being either endorsed or challenged that you can really draw out and have a lasting impression of? Because that's probably the thing that's going to most resonate in terms of you writing about it. Okay, because this next aspect, the time frame, changes quite a bit throughout the collection of stories, it's worthwhile looking at this in terms of the stories that have something similar. So this is a story in terms of the time frame. It's set in the present, but it's focusing on a reflection, or I should say it's written from the present setting, a reflection upon the past, or perhaps a coming of age. So quite a few of the stories are like that. So the idea that we're writing, you know, the author is writing, the narrator is speaking in the present day and looking back. So the dates at the start of the stories help that. So you can imagine this person sitting in the 1960s and writing about something that happened, you know, 15 to 20 or even more years ago. It gives you some sense of the space and the time. Okay, but some of the stories are very prescient. They are in that moment, and some of the stories are more reflective. So it's worthwhile distinguishing that. Okay, so the setting, the domestic setting, is what we're wanting you to do here is to show an understanding or capture an understanding of the family setting, the family structure. So this differs quite a lot. This is a very traditional family structure. Lots of children. We've got you might talk about the mother's role and the father's role, the idea of, father's role. You might talk about you might talk about the idea of even the extended family, so the uncle, etc. And again, you might make some sort of page reference. I'll just do a P. So page 4, say, for instance, has the roles. And then, of course, your paragraph 3 or whatever it might be is enough. But you would also be expected there to have, I guess, some annotation on that page, which I know we did the other day in class. So that's the idea. There is the family structure or the way the house looks, and obviously that differs from story to story quite a bit. In this case, it's very literal. It's very spelt out on the page. In many cases, it's not. The geographic setting obviously is is generally going to be much the same, but I think you need to make some specific distinctions. So this is Cape Breton. I noted in my notes here that it's a fishing, or it's on the water, because it differs from the mining ones, it differs from the farming ones, and they could be anywhere really. It doesn't matter really that it's on the water, but I think it helps you just to perhaps group the stories. Might be more useful for text response than it is for the creative, but these notes can be used for either. And we're talking about it's from the Midwest. Okay, so in that the story is being told about Cape Breton from the Midwest of America. So the idea that the sun has moved on from that location and moved somewhere else is important. Okay, let me continue down the page. So, okay, so what does register mean? So if you've done the initial readings of the framing notes and the ones on language particularly, you know that register is about the tone or the nature, the formality, it says in the brackets there obviously, the formality of the language. So this is where you're going to try and start thinking, particularly for your creative SAC, that what sort of quality of writing, what sort of quality of language do you need to maintain? So some of the stories are quite informal, or some moments within the stories are quite informal, but this story has a very formal, learn to type, formal, and a very formal sort of style. There's very few conjunctions and contractions, and things like that. The thing that's worthwhile saying here is that I think that it's tinged with a sense of melancholy. Okay, thank you, autocorrect. And the idea of trying to target or nail the idea here is the idea of how the language seems is, I guess, the first step in trying to establish how you're going to write, if you're going to write the same as the narrator. Now, this one here, we actually can't do for this story because it's our first. So I'm talking about the similarities to other texts. So I'm just going to write in A, but as you do the other stories, what you're doing is trying to make links between them. So if you go from this story to the Lost Sock Gift of Blood, which was the suggested homework text for this week, you might talk about the fact that it's told from the point of view of a male perspective. You might talk about the fact that it's also about set in sort of the Bay Area. But you also, it says similarities, but I think it's also important to note any significant differences. So if there's something unique about that story that stands apart from the others, I think it's worth noting there. Okay, repetition. So this is where you might pick out things that repeat throughout the story. So it might be images, it might be words, it might be phrases, okay, that repeat. And just note the effect. So you want the effect of those repetitions. I want to highlight the fact that obviously what I've written there is not what you're going to write. You're actually going to write the images, words, or phrases that repeat, perhaps giving some page numbers afterwards. But I want to highlight the fact that most of the time, repetition is the effect is to sort of reinforce or highlight ideas. It's there to sort of make the idea stand out. And you might think, well, what's the benefit of that idea being reinforced, highlighted, or being made to stand out from other things? Is it about tone? Is it about the emotional content of the character? Is it about the way that the character that's being described is meant to be seen by the reader. Think about what the purpose of that repetition is, because of course if you change narrative perspective and you want to repeat the same phrases that MacLeod repeated, but they were there to show the way that, say, the son viewed the father, well, the father's not going to use those same repetitions because he wouldn't view himself in the same way. Okay, literal language. So in this instance, it's really about highlighting moments where literal language is used. This is very concrete and descriptive. There's nothing being hidden. It's just really basic explanation, nothing sort of figurative or symbolic in it. We might read into that, but it's where those concrete things are. So for instance, the father's room. It might be the kitchen. It might be the mother. It might be the boat. Now, what you want to note is you might want to note the page references. You might want to write out some of the key phrases, particularly if you were writing a story set on the boat or you were writing a story set in the kitchen. You might want to pick up some of those concrete descriptions and really try and get your head around the fact that this is an actual space. But think about why that literal language is there. Remember, if you've read that framing reading, the literal language is there to show that this is a sort of a concrete thing. It's very certain, it's very stable, and stable. So it doesn't matter, over time it won't change, but it's also it's also completely objective. So it's not about the person, the narrator, who is narrating, putting their own flavor on it. This is just how things are. So by contrast, we have the figurative language. This is the stuff that is the reverse of the other. It's not concrete. It has subtext. It has hidden meaning. It has some subjectivity to it which expresses something about that narrator. So, for instance, if we looked at the father's dead body at the end, body, this is obviously something that has a lasting impression. It communicates a sense of danger or damage in choosing the wrong lifestyle, etc., etc. You might also talk about, say, the wrist protectors that the father wears, that are, these heavy chains around his wrist that are almost like he's trapped in the life that he's chosen, like handcuffs. All of those sorts of moments where you get rich symbolism, or you get, the chains are literally